In this video, we're going to talk about how to solve quadratic equations, and we're going to look at it by 4 different ways. The first is solving a quadratic equation by factoring. Then we'll look at solving a quadratic equation by taking the square root, often called the square root method. The third way we're going to look at it is by completing the square, and the fourth way is by using the quadratic formula. So if you're going to solve a quadratic equation by factoring, it's based on the zero product property, which says simply this, that if you're multiplying some things together, a times b times c, and it equals to 0, the only way that this can happen is if one of the factors that you're multiplying equals 0. So this will only be true when either a is equal to 0, or b is equal to 0, or c is equal to 0. So when you solve a quadratic equation by factoring, it's easiest to use this method when you're given a quadratic equation to solve that is factorable. For instance, if they give us this and they say solve x squared equals to negative 4x. This one would be very easy to solve by factoring. In order to do this, you need to get a 0 on one side. So we could say, okay, x squared plus 4x is equal to 0. And we could factor out the greatest common factor. We could pull out an x here, and we're left with x plus 4 equals to 0. Here's the first factor, and here's the second factor. Set the first factor equal to 0 and solve for x, but this one is already solved. There's one of our answers. Set the second factor equal to 0 and solve, and so this would be true when x is negative 4, and here is the second factor. Okay, here is another example. What if they gave us this one? X squared minus x minus 20 is equal to 20. Let's say they said solve this one. Alright, well, in order to solve this by factoring, we want to get a 0 on the right-hand side. So we'll say x squared minus x minus 20 is equal to 0. And I will solve this using, this is a trinomial. I consider this to be ax squared plus bx plus c equals to 0. And I solve this by the AC method. I take a times c. I find this product, and then I want to find two factors of a times c that add up to be b. So in this case, a is equal to 1, b is equal to negative 1, and c is equal to negative 20. So a times c is negative 20. I want to find two factors of negative 20 that will add up to be b, which is negative 1. We'll think about this for a while, and eventually I'll come up with negative 5 times positive 4. Negative 5 times positive 4 is negative 20. Negative 5 plus 4 is negative 1. And so when a is 1, you can rewrite this simply into x minus 5 times x plus 4. But I want to demonstrate what you would do if a is not equal to 1. If a is not equal to 1, you could rewrite the middle term into these two terms. Negative 5x plus 4x minus 5x plus 4x minus 20 equals to 0. So what I did here was I brought down the x squared term, I brought down the negative 20 term, and I rewrote negative x into minus 5x plus 4x. Once I have 4 terms, 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going to finish this off by grouping. I'm going to group the first two together and the second two terms together. I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor that I see here, which is simply an x, leaving me with x minus 5. I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor that I see here, which is a 4, leaving me with x minus 5. It's not a coincidence, it's because this is factorable that we have the same factor here. Now I'm going to factor out from each of these terms x minus 5, leaving me with x plus 4. Now I've factored this into x minus 5 times x plus 4. You finish this off by setting each factor equal to 0 and solving. X is going to equal to positive 5 and x is going to equal to negative 4. That's the two solutions that we get to that one. Okay, now let's Now let's solve something by taking the square root. All right? It's easy to solve by taking the square root whenever you can get your quadratic equation into the form something squared equals to something. So here are a few examples of that. If we're giving x squared is equal to 11, it is in this form, something squared equals to something. So then you simply take the square root of both sides. So if I take the square root of both sides, the square root of x squared is simply x, and this will equal to plus or minus the square root of 11. My two answers are x is equal to the square root of 11, and x is equal to the opposite, negative square root of 11. If you are given this, x minus 2 squared is equal to 6, you could solve this. You could take the square root of both sides. So the square root of x minus 2 squared is simply x minus 2. This will equal to plus or minus the square root of 6. Solve for x by adding 2 to both sides. X is equal to 2 plus or minus the square root of 6. Here are your two answers, 2 plus the square root of 6, 2 minus the square root of 6. Those are your two answers here. One more time. What if they give us this? 5x minus 3 squared plus 7 is equal to 0. Well, we need to get this in the form something squared equals to something. Here's our something squared, 5x minus 3. So let's move the 7 over. 5x minus 3 squared is equal to negative 7. Now we take the square root of both sides. The square root of 5x minus 3 squared is simply 5x minus 3. This will equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 7. Now what we come across is a negative under a square root, but the imaginary number I is defined to be the square root of negative 1. So we would consider the square root of negative 7 as the square root of negative 1 times 7, and we could simplify this by taking the square root of the negative 1, turns into an I, and leaving the square root of 7. So this ends up being 5x minus 3 is equal to plus or minus I times the square root of 7. Now we need to continue to solve for x. We'll add 3 to both sides. We'll divide both sides by 5. This is going to be 3/5 plus or minus I times the square root of 7 over 5. You can separate these two answers into 3/5 plus I, the square root of 7 over 5, 3/5 minus I times the square root of 7 over 5. And so on this video, I guess we just looked at how to solve quadratic equations by factoring and taking the square root. On the next video, we'll look at how to solve quadratic equations by completing the square and using the quadratic formula.